In 1841, a little book was published called Heroes and Hero Worship. It was a study by Thomas Carlyle of the biographical approaches to leadership which had happened over the years. This book comes to symbolize a first of a kind, a systematic inquiry and reflection on how leadership is expressed in the social world. The book is a first of a kind in as much as it represents the biographical approach which had been taken to leadership for, honestly, thousands of years. If one was a leader, then their story was told, and it kind of valorized them as a self-fulfilling prophecy of a leader. If a story or a poem had been written about him, takes Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus as the hero. If a story or a poem had been written about you, then you become the subject of leadership focus. This was the biographical approach, or what has been called the great man era of leadership studies. Great man signified that there was great nature inside of a person, that they were born leaders. So the age-old questions, are leaders born or made? The answer was they're born with blue blood, royal blood, or unusual characteristics that would separate them from the pack. It's almost a magical view. But there's a response to that. What if you don't have blue blood, royalty? What if grand exploits noticed on the grand horizons won't be noticed about what you do? So one of the reactions to the nature debate was the nurture debate. What if traits could be identified early and a leader could be cultivated and called towards greatness and instilled with skills and disciplines that made them more attractive or capable to achieve certain things in future circumstances? This was called the nurturing model. If we had an era of the great man, in this model we have the era of great nurture. The relationships, the antecedent conditions that move from traits to the practices that people can cultivate. And if Thomas Carlyle's work was in 1841 and the first era could have a time frame of when scholars began shifting their attention to this nurture, it would go from about 1841 to about 1907 or so. 1908 to 1947 would be that era of great nurture. Think about what was happening in the world, what was happening in your part of the world, if this is an international audience, through these time frames. Think of what was happening in 1947, moving to 1948, how many countries, Israel, India, many of the colonial powers were beginning to relinquish control as national independence movements arose. Blue blood, royalty wasn't not enough to keep folks' independency and oppression. From 1948 to 1967, scholars call this era the era of the pragmatic leader, or the era of the results-focused leader. The colonial powers continued to lower flags as young independent nations began to rise them. Countries like Nigeria and Kenya, Malaysia, Singapore. There were world wars from 1951, 1967. These are the years of the Korean and the Vietnamese War. Skirmishes throughout the Middle East, fomenting into a world where militaristic power and national power moves from its mercantile past to its military control models. This era of the results-oriented leader is an era of body counts, and an era of body bags, an era of Madison Avenue, counting how many people are clicking on television screens. Marketing is invented, television is experimented, and national networks are developing. This is a world where we begin to count, and information is coming at us at rapid rates where your biographical information, name, rank, and serial number, matters less than which organization you're installed in, where you're fit. We no longer need your name, rank, serial number. Should you fall in battle, another lance corporal will take your place. Please don't bother us with the details. This is an era of bottom lines, management by objectives. But there would be a reaction to just getting results done, to defining leadership as leader plus follower plus the achievement of a result. That polar relationship of what follower feels and thinks is also a part of the discussion. So there was a reaction that could be called the human relations movement. Martin Schimmers, a student of Frederick Hertzberg, said, all of leadership studies could be divided between what happened before 1967 and what happened after 1967, because a little theory came into existence called contingency theory. It said that leadership wasn't contingent upon a polar relationship, a dyadic relationship between leader-follower and a task that they would achieve together, but that leader's results were contingent upon what was going on inside of the people, achieving the purpose. Treating them as mere means to an end, as method towards the outcome, wouldn't do. So think about what was happening in the world in the 60s through about 1980. Not only were those colonial powers moving, but at the level of civil unrest throughout societies, where the average person was standing up for themselves saying, notice me. I remember as a 7-year-old walking home from school with my sister because the principal had said some serious words about a king being killed. Seemed like the thing to do, to remember some king, but it would be when I got home that I would see the black and white images on television and realize that that king was a Martin Luther King Jr. It was 1968, and the world was a really confusing place morally, socially, militarily, politically, historically. And the night before he died, he was there in Memphis supporting garbage workers who would hold up a sign that says, I am a man. You see, it mattered what people felt when you reduced them to a serial number. That thing could not be kept from speaking the way numbers can. From the 80s to the present, they have called this era the era of complexity. We're downsizing and niche marketing, and smartphones are in our pockets, keeping us track of minute-by-minute accountability and the capacity to speak to the space station from our phones through some app or another, certainly to watch them eat their dinner. It's a world where things have gotten smaller and faster, where what's inside of a person matters less in terms of, instead of that they show up as the digits in the marching line, logging in, remembering, resetting passwords, keeping on vigilant alert for how closely connected we are with the neighbor's login and Wi-Fi station next door. I call this era the era of disintegration. If the last one was an era of contingency, this is an era of disintegration, where a leader has to find out where they stand, what their values are, and nurture their roots during a time of so much fragmentation and relativism. There's an era of great nurture, the great man era. There's an era of great nature, the great man era. There's an era of great nurture. There's an era of getting results, of pragmatism. An era of getting context, the contingency era of leadership. And an era of complexity, where there's incredible disintegration, a call for roots. The question for you as you think about mission and think about the methods of mission, in which era were your feet planted in, or your leadership feet planted in? From whence did you grow? I'll tell my story. I grew up in the 60s. My dad had already been to Korea for a war and was shipped off in 68 to Vietnam for war. I grew up in a military household. As a young 17-year-old, I went in the military. I remember making rank by the 13th month I was in. I was an E4, and I was going off to non-commissioned officer school, and it was the first time I learned the definition of leadership, extensive, an ostensible definition, where you achieve your mission and purposes through people. And it was that through part that came under theological reflection when I came into the faith and realized that the standards of one context do not immediately translate to the standards of another. That my military modalities of leadership may not work well inside of missional settings or on a sports team or inside of a sales team. But it was beginning to reckon with that through word, that people were not merely throughputs, but they were the withputs. They were the purpose, the origin, purpose, and means and aim of any effort that we would do. And I found that I had to think about my leadership, think about finding a compatible method. So this is an invitation for you to reflect on which era yours were rooted in. Was it the great man era? Was it the great nurture era? Was it the pragmatic era? Was it the contingency era? Or was it the era of disintegration and complexity? I'll talk to you in the classroom.